This Vietnamese girl was captured by the US military and taken into a prison. In order to force her to reveal the whereabouts of the Viet Cong, the soldiers beat her, pulled her hair, kicked her hard, then tied her to a chair and repeatedly tormented her with electric shocks. After that, they tied her to a pillar, smeared honey on her legs and feet, and let ants continuously bite her skin. She was finally rescued, but the actions of the North Vietnamese soldiers made her suffering even more unbearable. This is a war film adapted from a real historical story. It is both a lament for women and a powerful accusation against war. Her name is Lu Lai, and she comes from a small village in central Vietnam. The people here work diligently in the fields, rising at sunrise and resting at sunset, living a very stable life. Everyone's face is filled with happy smiles. Mountains and rivers blend together here. The customs are simple and honest, and the atmosphere is quiet and peaceful, like a paradise far removed from the world. The little girl transplanting rice seedlings in the fields is Lu Lai. She was very sensible from a young age and often followed her mother to work in the fields. When there was free time, she would go with friends to watch folk operas or play and laugh among the farmland. She was just an ordinary child, yet her life would turn out to be anything but ordinary. In the summer of 1953, a French military unit stepped into this pure land and completely shattered its peaceful life. The French army entered the village, burning, looting, and committing countless acts of destruction. In just a few days, the village was reduced to ashes. The villagers were heartbroken and full of regret, yet completely powerless. In order to survive, her father had no choice but to take the family to more remote mountains to rebuild their home. Lu Lai gradually grew up in such an environment and became a graceful young woman. Lu Lai was the fourth child in her family. These are her eldest brother, her third brother, and her second sister. Although life was poor and simple, being able to live together as a family still made them feel very happy. However, the arrival of North Vietnamese soldiers once again disrupted the originally peaceful life here. They carried out large-scale conscription in the area. After an impassioned speech, Lu Lai's eldest brother and third brother resolutely stepped onto the path of defending their homeland. Although the family was reluctant to part, they had no choice but to accept it. A few days later, while Lu Lai was working in the fields, a helicopter suddenly descended overhead. Strong gusts of wind blew so hard that Lu Lai could barely open her eyes. It was her first time seeing a helicopter. Along with many American soldiers, these U.S. troops who supported the South Vietnamese forces had more advanced weapons, as tanks, armored vehicles, and submachine guns quickly assembled throughout the village. When the U.S. troops entered the village, they gathered all the villagers together and began to indoctrinate them. They told the villagers that as long as they organized themselves to resist North Vietnam, they would be given money, food, and various weapons and equipment. However, during this period, the U.S. troops not only seized grain and property but also committed countless abuses. The soldiers forced the villagers to build defensive fortifications to resist the Viet Cong. The classroom in the village also became a place for ideological re-education. Although the teacher did not want to do this, he had no choice but to comply in order to stay alive. After the U.S. troops left, North Vietnamese soldiers broke into the village again at night and killed the teacher in public. He had taught in the village for nearly 20 years and was the most respected elder teacher in the villagers' eyes. But in the eyes of the North Vietnamese soldiers, his actions were considered betrayal. They warned everyone that this was the consequence of helping South Vietnam and the United States. Even so, Lu Lai still supported the North Vietnamese soldiers, because both of her brothers were in their ranks. Caught between the two armies, the villagers lived in constant fear every single day. Then the thing they feared most finally happened. U.S. troops were ambushed by North Vietnamese soldiers near the village, and fierce fighting immediately broke out between the two sides. Poorly equipped, the North Vietnamese soldiers soon began to retreat. After that, U.S. aircraft launched relentless bombing, and the village that had only known peace for a few short years was once again reduced to ruins. Large numbers of South Vietnamese forces and U.S. troops then advanced into the village. Women who had already suffered at the hands of the soldiers hid in underground cellars, yet they were still discovered. In order to defend themselves, some of them even took out grenades and chose to perish together with the soldiers. Amid the chaos, Lu Lai was captured by U.S. troops, who believed she was a Viet Cong member. In order to force her to confess her identity and the whereabouts of other Viet Cong members, the officer brutally beat her. then tied her to a chair and repeatedly tortured her with electric shocks. She endured pain beyond what an ordinary person could bear, yet she did not say a single word. The officer pulled out a dagger and threatened Lu Lai, saying he would give her only one day to think it over, and if she still refused to speak, her life as a woman would be destroyed. Before long, Lu Lai and 2 other girls were dragged out again by the soldiers. They had come up with even more cruel punishments. The 3 girls were tied to pillars, honey was smeared on their feet, and ants were allowed to swarm and bite their skin. Waves of piercing pain pushed them to the brink of collapse. Even more disturbing, the soldiers placed venomous snakes against their bodies, causing the girls to scream in terror. Every second in that place felt like living in hell. Just as the US troops were preparing to execute Lu Lai, her mother offered all the family's savings to bribe the officer, allowing Lu Lai to narrowly escape death. After Lu Lai was brought back by her mother, she was met with suspicious looks from the villagers, who whispered that even the Viet Cong no longer trusted her. Late at night, 2 North Vietnamese soldiers seized Lu Lai and prepared to carry out an execution. No matter how her parents pleaded or explained, it was useless. The soldiers dragged Lu Lai outside the village to carry out the sentence, and when a gun was pressed against the back of her head, she was overwhelmed with grief and despair. However, the soldiers did not kill her. Instead, they forced her down, restrained her, and tore her clothes apart. What the North Vietnamese soldiers did made her suffering worse than death itself. Not until dawn did Lu Lai stagger home, exhausted, like a walking shell. From that moment on, she no longer trusted either side. She swore never to take part in any organization again, whether the US forces or the Viet Cong. All she wanted was to stay far away from these terrifying demons. In order to encourage her daughter, her mother took her to the city to work as a servant for a wealthy family. This was Lu Li's first time entering the city, as she had lived in the countryside her entire life, surrounded by simple and honest farmers. But the city was full of hidden dangers, and this was what she was about to face. Unexpectedly, the male head of the household set his eyes on the pure and beautiful Lu Lai, who was only 18 years old. This middle-aged man was gentle, considerate, and carried himself like a true gentleman. Even when Lu Lai was clumsy and made mistakes again and again, the man always forgave her. With his constant care and attention, the girl who was just beginning to understand love completely fell for him and willingly gave herself to the man she believed was worth trusting for life. However, Lu Lai overlooked the fact that this man already had a wife and 2 children, and they were destined to have no future. Even worse, Lu Lai became pregnant. When her mother found out, she was furious, because if the wife discovered it, the consequences would be unimaginable. Her mother forced Lu Lai to get rid of the child. With no money to see a doctor, they could only rely on crude methods. Under her mother's watch, she jumped up and down on the stairs, hoping this would cause a miscarriage. Every step Lu Lai took was filled with pain, but it was useless, as the strong baby survived. As her belly grew larger day by day, the wife eventually found out. Lu Lai believed the man she loved would stand up for her, but in front of his wife, he treated her with cold indifference. Her mother had no choice but to beg the man to allow them to give birth to the child before leaving, but the wife firmly refused and demanded that they leave immediately. However, since the child was her husband's, she agreed to provide monthly support. They were still driven out, but they never received a single payment from the man. As her belly continued to grow, life became increasingly difficult for Lu Lai, and she could only support herself by selling alcohol and cigarettes on the streets while heavily pregnant. At this point, she was no longer the naive and innocent girl she once was. She became slick and street smart, able to deceive, curse, and flirt, because only then would people support her business. There was only one bottom line she would not cross, and that was never selling her body. When she encountered city officers, she had to bribe them with money, and what she earned was barely enough to survive. She was now living in the red light district in the south of the city. Her mother had returned to the village, and the one supporting her was her second sister. Her second sister had become a woman who serviced American soldiers. No one mocked them here, because at this time they had no dignity and no rights, and simply staying alive already felt like a blessing from heaven. After a long day of work, Lu Lai dragged her exhausted body home, only to encounter an American soldier looking for her second sister. Her sister was busy with a client, and the impatient soldier turned his attention to Lu Lai, scaring her into running outside. At that very moment, Lu Li's father came to the city to visit her second sister. Her sister shamelessly showed affection to the American soldier right in front of their father. The father helplessly lowered his head, watching his daughter being dragged into the room as suggestive sounds came from inside. The father sitting outside remained unusually quiet. Lu Lai hid behind him, watching silently. not wanting her father to see what she had become. Her second sister had already brought shame upon him, and if he saw his once obedient youngest daughter carrying another man's child, he might not be able to endure it. After it was over, the father asked his second daughter if she had any news about Lulai. Her sister said she had gone out, that she was living with her now, and that her life was going well. Unable to see his youngest daughter, the father left a message, saying that right and wrong in life would be judged in their own time. After the father left, the two sisters began to argue fiercely. Lulai scolded her sister for entertaining clients in front of their father. Her sister felt deeply wronged and said that if she refused the Americans, none of them would have a good outcome. She also lashed out at Lulai for being pregnant with another man's child, asking how that was any different from selling herself. Furious and humiliated, Lulai slapped her sister hard, and the two erupted into a bitter fight. In truth, her second sister had already done everything she could, hoping to earn enough money to take the family out of the country, but no one understood her sacrifices. Completely disheartened, her sister drove Lulai out of the house. In order to survive, Lulai could only scavenge outside US military camps, hoping to trade scraps for a little food. Suddenly, Lulai saw a woman in a trash bag who had been abused by US soldiers, and she stumbled backward in terror. In that moment, she finally seemed to understand her second sister's situation. Not long after, Lulai successfully gave birth to a baby boy, and as a new mother, her face was filled with joy and happiness. People around her advised her to abandon or drown the child, saying only then could she wash away her shame. However, Lulai was resolute, and even with tears in her eyes, she vowed to raise the child she had given birth to. Another year passed, and Lulai managed to save some money, so she went to a US military camp, hoping the Americans could arrange a more respectable job for her. Unexpectedly, as the American soldier spoke, he began to undo his belt. Lulai was terrified, punched the soldier to the ground, grabbed a stool, smashed the door, and escaped, because this was Lulai's bottom line. No matter how hard life became, she would never bring shame upon her father. With no other choice, Lulai returned to her old trade and once again started selling alcohol and cigarettes on the side. One day, a military police officer approached Lulai and suggested that she entertain his two new recruits, saying she could name any price. Lulai replied that there were plenty of cheap women over there, but the two recruits had their eyes set only on Lulai and promised to pay $1,000. At that time, $1,000 was an enormous sum, enough to support her and her child for an entire year. Lulai had never seen so much money, and she hesitated. Looking at her child, she struggled inside, torn between motherhood and dignity. After intense inner conflict, Lulai ultimately gave in. She slowly walked toward the two soldiers, casting her father's teachings and her own principles far behind her. From that moment on, Lulai felt even more ashamed and no longer dared to return home. Not long after, devastating news came from her hometown. Her father had been falsely accused of being a traitor and was brutally killed by the Viet Cong. Both of his sons were still fighting in the Viet Cong ranks. So how could he possibly be a traitor? Lulai never got to see her father one last time, and her grief was overwhelming. She spent all her savings to hold a proper funeral for her father. Soon the fighting grew more intense, and American soldiers filled the streets, becoming a common sight everywhere. It was here that Lulai met a US Army major named Steve. He took a strong liking to Lulai and was drawn to her eyes full of stories from the very first glance. But Lulai harbored deep hatred toward the US military and was unwilling to get close to any Americans again. Unexpectedly, Steve persisted, saying she had a unique presence that was impossible to resist. Lulai originally thought he was no different from other American soldiers, but as she got to know him, she realized this major was not the same. He was not short-tempered, nor did he rely on violence. Instead, he was gentle and deeply respectful toward women. Even when he entered Lulai's home, he merely sat beside her bed and talked, never making any inappropriate moves. This caused a dramatic change in Lulai's attitude toward Steve. He talked with Lulai about her child, his own family, and his past experiences. As time went on, Lulai realized he was not a bad person at all, and she finally let down her guard. Just as Steve was about to leave, a torrential rain poured down, forcing him to stay overnight at Lulai's home. Late that night, Steve was trapped in recurring nightmares, and after waking in shock from years of war trauma, he nearly harmed Lulai by accident. Looking at this fragile and helpless man, whose experiences mirrored her own, Lulai felt a surge of compassion, and in that moment, she did not refuse him. Only afterward did she realize how easily she had given herself to this man. Unexpectedly, this time she had made the right choice. Steve did not leave, but instead brought toys for the child and 2 engagement rings. He swore as a soldier that he would take responsibility for Lu Lai and her child. He also promised that once the war ended, he would take her and the children back to the United States to live a happy and peaceful life. Looking at this sincere man before her, Lu Lai was moved to tears for the first time. Over the next 3 years, Lu Lai moved into the American base with her children and her mother. She and Steve also had a second child together. This was a relatively stable period in their lives, and Lu Lai regained hope for the future. However, her mother did not support Lu Lai and was unwilling to go to the United States with her. By this stage of the war, the United States was stretched thin. North Vietnamese forces launched fierce counterattacks, and the fighting reached their area. Steve could only send Lu Lai and the children away first, while he had to stay behind to fight alongside his soldiers. The helicopter could only carry the mother and children out of the combat zone, and there was nothing more they could do. The people here were gripped by panic. Refugees were everywhere, and Lu Lai could only flee from place to place with her 2 children. On a bus, she once again witnessed the twisted nature of humanity under the shadow of war. South Vietnamese soldiers boarded the bus to conduct inspections, and Lu Lai sensed something was wrong, so she quickly lowered her head to avoid their gaze. They dragged several young girls away. Before long, the girls came back from the military truck limping and crying, their clothes torn and their bodies covered in injuries, and Lu Lai immediately knew what had happened. After arriving at the refugee area, she worried constantly about her husband. Every response from the military said the same thing. Missing with no information, Lu Lai believed she had lost Steve forever. She felt completely hopeless and had no idea what to do next. Then fate played a cruel joke on her. Steve came back. He was alive, and the family embraced each other in overwhelming joy. After that, Steve took her and the children back to the United States. It was quiet and peaceful there, with no war, only safety and freedom. Lu Lai styled her hair and changed into new clothes, looking even more radiant and beautiful. When she met Steve's family, they treated her kindly and warmly. No one cared about her past, and no one questioned it. The moment Lu Lai stepped into the house, she was stunned by everything in front of her. Steve's home was spacious and luxurious, like entering a palace, leaving her completely speechless. Before this, such a life was something Lu Lai could never have imagined even in her dreams. The double-door refrigerator was filled with all kinds of food. Here there was no fear of war, only the simple dilemma of what to eat for dinner. Even the discarded food looked tempting. This sense of happiness made it impossible for her to contain her excitement. After enduring so much suffering, Lu Lai finally welcomed a beautiful and happy life. In 1986, Lu Lai returned to Vietnam with her 3 sons. By then, the war had long ended, and her former hometown had been renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Lu Lai brought her eldest son to meet his biological father. The man who was once cowardly and irresponsible now had a failed business and looked no different from an ordinary person. The love and hatred of those chaotic years had faded into the past, and father and son held each other tightly. When Lu Lai returned to her hometown, she became the focus of the entire village, with people following her everywhere just to watch. Her mother was now covered in wrinkles, with hair turned completely white, having stayed here guarding her father's memory for a lifetime. Seeing her daughter after so many years, her mother burst into tears. Her second sister also came out of the room, now so aged that she was almost unrecognizable. Thinking back on her actions back then filled Lu Lai with deep guilt. Her eldest brother had returned from the battlefield, but her third brother was gone forever. Time had passed, everything had changed, and nothing could ever return to how it once was. Lu Lai's life was full of ups and downs, stumbles and struggles, and in the end, she returned to the fields of her childhood. Now she had come back, but this place no longer truly belonged to her. The film ends here. This film is called Heaven and Earth, and it is adapted from real events. The screenwriter is a woman named Lu Lai, and the character in the film is based on her own life. Through her personal experiences, she truthfully portrayed the cruelty of the Vietnam War and the tragic lives of women under war. Although Lu Lai was fortunate in the end and became an American, her hometown was no longer her home, and her loved ones were no longer the same. Out of guilt, she wrote 2 memoirs about her experiences in her later years. Heaven and Earth is a film about helplessness and hope. Every person only has one life and can only live within a specific environment, all determined by fate. Yet suffering seems to be an eternal theme. War, illness, separation, and disaster all bring pain to humanity. Human beings are small and powerless, never truly able to change this inevitable suffering. All we can do is endure silently, face it with strength, and hold on to hope. believing that everything will pass and light always comes after the storm. This is the inner message the film seeks to convey. It tells us how to face adversity calmly, how to view the ups and downs of life with a steady heart, neither rejoicing excessively nor sinking into despair. I am a film enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.